Good day, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 launch of the Global Terrorism Index. We are excited to be joined by so many of you across the globe. My name is Melissa Leffis, and I am the Chief of Strategy at the Global Center on Cooperative Security. We are delighted to co-host today's event together with the Institute for Economics and Peace, the authors of the Global Terrorism Index 2020, and the United States Institute for Peace in collaboration with the Global Research Network of the United Nations Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate. At the Global Center, our mission is to achieve lasting security by advancing inclusive, rights-based policies, partnerships, and practices that address the root causes of violent extremism. We know that evidence-based and data-driven approaches to countering terrorism and preventing violent extremism are imperative to stemming the tide of this ever-evolving threat while not sensationalizing or exceptionalizing terrorism. The GTI has come to be a reliable reference for terrorism trends, statistics, and global level analysis. This year is no exception. Now, in its 8th year, the report uses the data of the Global Terrorism Database of the University of Maryland to analyze the impact of terrorism and trends in its national and global occurrence. It presents these in a highly accessible and visual manner, providing snapshots of principal findings based on the wealth of data, which are complemented by guest contributions from esteemed experts in our field. The report substantiates several key findings, including the devastating toll terrorism has had on the Sahel, where extreme poverty and climate change continue to challenge human security. The rise in far-right terrorism in the West, distinguished from other forms of terrorism because it occurs almost entirely outside the context of ongoing conflict and war, and the expected impact of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. This year's report also includes an innovative chapter that looks at the relationship between terrorism and 13 socioeconomic indicators, such as human rights protections, equality and liberty, corruptions, and group grievances. Because of all of this, the GTI continues to be an important report that is read well beyond counterterrorism policy and research circles. To walk us through the report's key findings, we are pleased to have Steve Kilalea, founder and executive chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace, with us today. Following his presentation, reflections will be shared by Assistant Secretary General Michelle Konings, the executive director of CCAT, and Alistair Reid, executive director of the Resolve Network and senior expert at the United States Institute of Peace. Finally, a few housekeeping notes. Our hope is to provide ample time for what we expect to be a rich Q&A session. You are invited to submit your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to address as many of them as possible. This event is being live streamed on YouTube. The recording will be made available again after our event. We welcome your social media engagement. Please follow any of the hosting organizations of today's event to learn more about the GTI and our respective work. For any technical difficulties, please contact my colleague Adele Westerhuis via the chat function. It is now my pleasure to hand it over to you, Steve, to walk us through the report's finding. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that, Michelle. It's very much appreciated. So what I've got here is a presentation. It's about 25 minutes. It's a very fast-paced presentation. So you'll have to bear with me. So we'll get through about 30 slides in about 25 minutes. Oh, hang on. Just give us a sec. I'll have to share the screen. Oops, okay, right. We're there. Okay, ready to go. So I'll get a little bit on the Institute for Economics and peace first. It was set up to understand the intersection between business, peace and economic, placing special emphasis on metrics to measure peace, and then to ascribe an economic value to changes in peace. The work's used extensively globally by groups like the OECD, Commonwealth Secretariat, World Bank, United Nations, and many, many different think tanks. Work's also now included thousands of university courses around the world. In any one year, we have over 500,000 downloads of our reports. That's just from our website. We estimate 2 to 3 times that number comes off others. We have an extensive media reach, 21 billion media impressions last year. With the Global Terrorism Index, which we launched 2 weeks ago, we're already at about 7 billion media impressions from over about 1,000 articles from that. We have offices in Sydney, where we're headquartered, offices in New York, which Michael Collins runs, Brussels, The Hague, Mexico City, and Harare. So it's a global organisation. It gives us policy reach, as well as that with the offices in Harare and Mexico City, to be able to feed off practical experience from in countries which you could consider in conflict. So let's move on quickly with the GTI. So this is the 8th year we've been doing it. It's used by most people involved in terrorism globally. Ranks 163 countries. So that's about 99.7% of the world's population. And when we come down to the Global Peace Index, this index actually is just one indicator within the Global Peace Index, which consists of 23 different indicators. It's developed by us. We use data, as Melissa mentioned, from the START database from the University of Maryland, along with a whole range of other different data sets as well. So now let's move on. So we'll just quickly go through the key findings and get into more detail as we move on. So the good news is terrorism's actually down 15%. And this is for the 5th consecutive year since 2014. So deaths now are 13,826 in 2019. The good news also is ISIL, the core of it's diminishing. So this is the first year actually since its inception that it's recorded less than 1,000 deaths. However, we are finding far-right terrorism increase. It's up 250% in the last 5 years, and but we need to put it into perspective, and it's off a very low death base. The 4 countries most affected by terrorism, deaths in all of those 4 countries decreased, which is, again, very, very good news. However, if we're looking at sort of one of the areas of concern, what we're finding is the centre of gravity for ISIL now is shifting to sub-Saharan Africa. So when we look into that, 7 of the 10 countries with the largest increases in terrorism reside in the Sahel and Horn of Africa region. So ISIL is far from a spent force. What we're finding that its affiliates and branches are highly active, and they're the ones responsible for most of the deaths in the Sahel. And they launched attacks in 27 different countries around the world in 2019. So now if we have a look at this is a quick mud map of the world, red being very, very bad, green being very, very good. Now note small amount of green. So to be green, what it means is you haven't had an terrorist attack in your country for at least 5 years, because we go back 5 years in terms of calculating the index. There's only 33 countries globally which haven't had a terrorist attack in the last 5 years. So as we can see, it's still a wide phenomena. Now here's a quick list of the countries which are at the top of or I should say the worst affected by terrorism. You'll note all of these countries are in a conflict, other than India, but there are parts of India which are in conflict as well. So Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, and Syria all had substantial drops in the number of people killed. I think one of the things which is really worth noting is most deaths occur within a conflict zone. So if we're looking at that, I think this year, 96% of all deaths occurred in a conflict zone, and the lowest it's been was 90% in any 1 year. So what it shows is to get rid of the scourge of terrorism, the real thing we need to do is stop the ongoing conflicts around the world. So now, if we look at it, if we look at the key findings, it's down from its peak in 2014. That's 15.5% lower than the prior year. So it's just a great continuing drop. If we look at the countries most affected by terrorism, what we find is that 80% of the deaths come from 10 countries. So we can see that we're looking at it globally, in many ways it's very, very concentrated, but as I mentioned earlier on, it is also widely spread. So Afghanistan accounts for 41%. Most of that's due to the Taliban, and then followed by Nigeria, and then we drop off to a number of countries at 4%. We look at the countries which So we look at the countries which had the biggest decreases in terrorism. Again, as I mentioned, the four most affected by terrorism: Afghanistan, Nigeria, Iraq, and Syria. But then we find Pakistan, Libya, Somalia, and India also all improved. Now, if we go to the other end of the scale and we look at the countries which were affected the most, Burkina Faso had the biggest change in the number of deaths. That was followed by Sri Lanka, Mozambique, Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, Mali, Yemen, Niger, Cameroon, and New Zealand. You'll note that Sri Lanka and New Zealand were ones where what we would not have expected to have Islamist or have far-right or Islamist attacks. So what it shows is terrorism can hit anywhere. So now if we come back and we look at the economic impact, it was $26 billion in 2019. What I'd say, this is a very simple model of the economic impact. It doesn't count the cost of the security forces, counterintelligence operations, the effects on the muting of business and many other insurance and many other things. But if you look at the countries most affected, Afghanistan, Syria, Nigeria, and Burkina Faso. So now we'll move on and we'll just look at the trends. So really we've just looked at the last year so far. And so this is really interesting graph because what it does, it shows the rise and fall, particularly related to Boko Haram and ISIL over the years. And we can see how rapidly it rose from 2011, peaking in 2014, and then the various counterinsurgency operations around the world, we can see the effect on them. That was particularly with the destruction of the Islamic State and the reclaiming of territories in Syria and Iraq. So again, if we come down and we look at the deadliest groups in the world, this gives you an idea of the way the four major ones have moved over the last 20 years. So Taliban, Boko Haram, ISIL, and Al-Shabaab. So again, what we can see now is that Taliban is the deadliest group in the world. And so again, that comes back to conflict. And if we can get the conflict in Afghanistan sorted, then we'll probably find those numbers will fall away very quickly. But what's interesting, this graph here just gives you an idea of where terrorism occurs. So if we look in this one in 2019, just under 10,000 people died in what we classify as war. So that's where you get over 1,000 people killed in a conflict. We now look at the minor armed conflicts, and there where people get killed over 100 and less than 1,000 deaths. We find it's dropped now to about 4,700. And then if we come down and we look at the non-conflict countries, we're now down and talking into the hundreds. So this really does drive home that relationship between conflict and terrorism. Now, if we look at the various regions of the world, this is quite interesting. So if we went back to 2014, 15, 16, the Middle East was by far the area of the world most affected. But we can see now is that's fallen right away. So it's the third least affected region by terrorism globally, with South Asia being first and Sub-Saharan Africa coming up quickly. So now we start to look at changes which are going on with terrorism globally. This will give you an idea of just the change over the 2 decades from the 2000s to the 2010s. And so we can see this massive increase in deaths through terrorism in the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And so it's really quite intense. But what I'd say, terrorism has been there for a long while. And even if we get the Islamic terrorism under control, it doesn't mean that terrorism still won't exist. And so this gives you a pretty clear idea of ISIL and what's related, the deaths related to it. So now if you look at this and study it carefully, you'll find that the two top bars here are affiliates and provinces of ISIL. And what you'll note is you can go back to 2016, and there's been virtually no change in the number of deaths caused by them. Where the drop has been in the major operations of the Islamic State. And so what we can see from this is that it's also 27 countries where attacks have been launched by the affiliates, provinces and ISIL, which shows that it's still a wide trend, and it's a much harder one to get under control. Now, if we look at this gives you an idea of the number of countries which have recorded an attack by ISIL. And as I mentioned, in 2019, it's 27. It's off from its peak, which was 35 in 2017. Its peak was 35, and it's off now to 27 in 2019. But still, this is a worrying trend. And if you look at the line really running from about 2015, it's pretty flat. We look at the regional distribution, and as we mentioned, we're talking about the centre of gravity shifting towards the sub-Saharan Africa. This clearly gives an idea of just what regions and the percentage of attacks. Where in 2014, it was nearly all, 2013-14, it was nearly all the Middle East. We can then slowly see South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa taking up more and more of the percentage of attacks. We can now see that that's where the centre of the terrorism lies globally. Now, we recently brought out a register called an ecological threat register. And what that did is looked at 8 different ecological threats, then looked at what countries had the biggest threats, and also the number of threats, and also looked at their societal resilience, which was measured through the positive peace framework, which the Institute for Economics and Peace has developed. And what was interesting, there were overlaps. So, for example, the country which had the most ecological threats turned out to be Afghanistan. The 2 countries which had the most water-related conflicts in the last decade were Yemen and Iraq. And so as we looked into this, we could see, and some of the stuff must go back centuries, there's this relationship between resource degradation and conflict. And one of the byproducts of conflict is terrorism. So as we looked at the countries, the 7 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which are most affected by terrorism, what we could see is their projected population growth was phenomenal. So we've got 6 of the 7 here, and all of them will have population growth in the next 30 years of greater than 90%. And so just to put it in perspective, there are only 17 countries in the world which are expected to double their population in the next 30 years. So what we can see in all these countries, there's a lot of fragility related to both government and the societal resilience, and then also the resilience against sort of water and food as well. So this all plays in together in terms of where we're seeing the rising areas of terrorism. Now, the far-right terrorism's got a lot of interest from this report. In fact, a lot of the media reports are dominated. So here we have a number of incidences and the number of deaths. And this is in what we would term the West. So if we're looking at this, what we'll find is that if we look at the number of religious incidences, are far less the number of political incidences. Now, note this huge jump in 2017. That was related to far-left terrorist incidences in Germany around the G20 summit, where a lot of the left-wing protesters tried to shut down the transit system. They were non-violent, but still they get recorded as an incident. Now, if we look at this, this gives you an idea of just the increase in the far-right terrorist attacks. The Andres Breivik incident in Norway in 2011 seems to be the starting point for all this to take off. We can look over the last 4 years, we can see the number of incidences ranged around about 50. So in 2019, 81 people were killed by far-right terrorism. 59 of them were actually in New Zealand, just to put the thing into perspective. And that compares to 13,826, which were killed globally. Now, this gives you an idea of just the areas in the world where most of these attacks have been occurring, but it is up 250%, and that trend is concerning. So one of the things which is of concern, if we go back to the decade to 2020, what we find is that demonstrations and riots globally increased by 246%. And so now the economic downturn from COVID-19, we'd expect, and when the lockdowns finish, we'd expect these level of demonstrations and riots to increase moving forward. So I think this is a concern, and it's the backdrop from which terrorism can arise. Now, if we look at the distribution of far-right incidences, we find the United States has by far the most. That's followed by Germany, United Kingdom, France, Sweden, and then a small percentage is made up from 33 other nations. But if we come around and now we look at the deaths, you get quite a different distribution. So we find the United States has had the most, but the next two countries which have had the most death from far-right terrorism aren't countries where we would have expected it beforehand, Norway and New Zealand. So one of the things which is very different about the far-right terrorism is the affiliations. We find that there's far less of the attacks are actually affiliated with an organisation. This goes back to 1970, but if we look at the attacks over the last few years, all of them really aren't affiliated with any group. They're lone wolves who get radicalised online through a set of belief systems and then go out and act on them. Now, if we start to look at mass shootings, what we can see here is the changes in mass shootings over the years. This is looking at just simply inside the United States only. But what we can see is that there's the number of mass shootings are radically on the rise since about 2012. And what we can see is about a quarter, roughly, of them are related to terrorism. The rest are not. So that puts that into some perspective. But the real issue really is the increase in mass shootings, which, as many of us know, comes around to the availability of guns. Now, this was probably the thing which, out of everything in this report, stood out to me the most. So we've done a whole lot of analysis of various forms of polling and other stuff like that. So we went back to, let's say, November 2017, which is not very long ago, not very long ago. What we find is at that point, less than 10% of both Republicans and Democrats felt that political violence could be partly justified. And that's just steadily increased to November 2019. In the last 6 months, or the 6 months since then, through to about June, what we've found is that that's increased radically. So now you've got about 35%, both Democrats and Republicans believe that political violence can be partly justified, and that is a truly worrying trend. And that would underpin the kind of thought processes which could lead to terrorism in the future in the US, unless that trend can be brought under control. Now, if we look into the Western democracies, there's a number of underlying trends we can see there going back over the last decade. So this covers, the US had the 10th largest drop in positive peace globally in the last decade, and that's a lot. That's just not due to the pump the Trump presidency. There were a lot of other things which were underpinning this move. So things like group grievances have increased, the quality of the information's decreased, the fighting between elites has increased. That's been particularly true in the US, but you can also see it in the Brexit debate, and you can also see it reflected in German politics, to just name a couple of others. Measures of democracy have also decreased. Measures of freedom of the press have decreased, and also measures of the equitable distribution of resources. And that's not equal, it's equitable. So these are the kind of trends which in the long run fuel alienation of people from society. And then they look for causes to attach to, and having attached to causes, create terrorism. We've also done a lot of work now on systems and terrorism, and I'll cover just a little bit of this really quickly. So one of the interesting things with terrorist groups, their survival rate, particularly in the first year, is not very good. Then after that, they fall off. So look, really, if you take the ones which were active in 2002, we get down to 2019, we find that there's over 80% of them disappear. Now, a lot of it doesn't mean the fighters disappear. They quite often merge into other groups, break off and create others. So it's a very, very dynamic and fluid environment, but when you see that length time for terrorist groups, you can argue it one way is that the counter-terrorism is really quite effective, or secondly, it's merges and changes the shape so quickly, it's very, very hard to stay on top of. So group grievances is something which comes up. It's mildly statistically significant in the West with a correlation factor of 0.25. But if we move out of the advanced economies and move into the rest of the world, it's really, really highly statistically associated. So 0.67. So that's one of the areas which we believe is important to focus on. The other thing, as we move into the developing world, we find it's also its levels of corruption, its fractionalized elites, group grievances. They seem to be right in the core of it. Now, we did a lot of work on systems thinking. We came up with this concept looking at, and this is a very simplified diagram out of a more complex diagram, but I haven't put that up here because it's too hard to comprehend in a very short presentation. But what we found is this concept of influence. The influence a terrorist organisation can be filled in many ways. That influence can be sort of capture of land, it could be through terrorist attacks and stuff. So there are three things which actually feed into this, and they all feed into each other, which in turn sort of increase the momentum of the terrorist group. First is the media coverage and social media content and presence of the groups. So that poses difficult questions. What is for anyone here who's in the media, what is the correct amount of media coverage? Because you certainly want to cover it, but if you bring it up too much, then you actually create copycat events. So if we looked at the Andrew Breivik example earlier on from Norway, and we saw that massive increase in far-right terrorism, many of the people who created later attacks would see him as being an influencer. The second is funding. So more coverage you get, where even if it's notorious, more likely you are to find funding. The funding and the media coverage feeds back in to converting sympathisers over to recruits. And then the recruits actually can get more media coverage and can raise more funds. So any effective counter-terrorism strategy really needs to be focusing on all three. Now, my friends, that's the end of one very, very fast-paced presentation.
Thank you so much, Steve. That is a lot of content to cover and extremely helpful. I especially appreciate the systems theory thinking that really we need to be addressing terrorism in a non-linear manner to really understand all the various socioeconomic systems at play as we look to counter and prevent violent extremism and terrorism. I have the pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, the Assistant Secretary General, Michelle Connix. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Excellencies, distinguished participants, it's my great pleasure to address you all at the launch of the 8th Global Terrorism Index. And thanks so much to Steve for his insightful presentation. Thank you to all our partners, the Global Center on Cooperative Security, the Institute of Economics and Peace, the United States Institute of Peace, and the Resolve Network for organizing today's event. Countering terrorism continues to present significant and unique challenges. As highlighted in this year's GTI, the threat posed by terrorism and violent extremism is increasingly diffuse, diverse, and decentralized. And of course, the world is also facing a generation-defining crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, which threatens to undermine our counterterrorism efforts and to intensify the drivers of radicalization towards violence. Our experiences over the last few months have reaffirmed that transnational threats and challenges require whole of society, multilateral and holistic responses that are backed by evidence-based research and data-driven approaches, are gender-sensitive and in full compliance with international human rights law. The integration of empirical research, such as the Global Terrorism Index, and the sharing of emerging terrorist trends with member states are essential elements of the work of the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate. We achieved this in large part through our global research network, the GRN, consortium of over 100 universities and think tanks that keep us and the Counterterrorism Committee of the Security Council informed about the latest research and emerging trends, threats and challenges. And this collaboration is complemented by our close partnership with the UN entities, country teams, international regional organizations, civil society organizations, the private sector, and our ongoing dialogue with all member states. Although the threat of terrorism endures in many regions across the world, the 8th GTI index shows that overall deaths from terrorism fell for the 5th consecutive year in 2019. This is, of course, a very welcome development. However, we continue to see worrying signs of new and emerging terrorist threats, including in Africa. One of the trends being closely monitored by CCAT is a rise of ISIL and its affiliates in the newer battlefields of the Sahel, the Lake Chad Basin, and southern and eastern Africa. This trend is reflected in the index, which notes that 7 of the 10 member states showing the highest increase in deaths from terrorism are in the sub-Saharan Africa. In view of the urgency of this challenge, CCAT and the 1267 monitoring team will organize a joint open briefing on ISIL in Africa next year. And the threat posed by ISIL and its affiliates is compounded by the continued challenges posed by foreign terrorist fighters. It's essential that member states develop and implement comprehensive human rights compliant prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration, so-called PRR measures for foreign terrorist fighters and their family members that are gender and age sensitive. Much more work remains to be done in this regard. And to promote dialogue with civil society, CCAT recently organized a consultation on the development and implementation of human rights compliant PRR strategies. The consultation enabled civil society organizations from across the globe to discuss their experiences and challenges in the field. In order to ensure the necessary whole-of-society approach, we must continue to bring together such diverse groups of stakeholders, including civil society organizations, women, victims, support groups, youth, academia, religious actors, and community leaders. One of the most prominent threats highlighted in the index is the rise of extreme right-wing terrorism, predominantly in North America and in Europe. During our assessment visits on behalf of the Counterterrorism Committee, we have heard growing concerns from many member states about the evolving threat from extreme right-wing actors. Drawing on its engagement with member states and its global research network partners, CCAT published 2 trends alerts earlier this year. one on the transnational threat of extreme right-wing terrorism, and another one on those actors who are co-opting the COVID-19 pandemic. These publications provided a timely analysis of emerging trends, gaps, and challenges associated with this worrying phenomenon. We also organized the first open briefing of the committee on this topic, as well as a meeting of the Global Research Network attended by practitioners, researchers, and policymakers from around the globe. Our analysis suggests that extreme right-wing terrorist actors are increasingly operating transnationally, including in financial and operational areas, and exploiting the internet for radicalization, terrorism, and recruitment purposes. These actors have also attempted to co-opt the COVID-19 pandemic to propagate baseless conspiracy theories and incite violence and attacks. As already mentioned, the pandemic has presented us with unprecedented challenges. Pandemic-related economic challenges and social restrictions, including closures of educational centers, community-based programs, and curtailed employment and entertainment opportunities, may worsen existing grievances. And though these same restrictions have also created operational challenges for terrorist groups themselves. In June, another paper on COVID-19 terrorism and counterterrorism explored how terrorist groups had sought to exploit the pandemic. As many people continue to spend considerable amounts of time online, the efforts of such groups to recruit and radicalize towards terrorism through digital platforms, including gaming, continue to cause concern. The pandemic has also created new challenges to our efforts to curtail misinformation and stop the dissemination of terrorist narratives. The spreading of conspiracy theories and misinformation can create confusion and chance in society, potentially fueling, and chaos in society rather, potentially fueling radicalization to violence. And our partnerships with public and private sector actors through forums such as Attack Against Terrorism and GIFCT have been pivotal in helping technology platforms to address these issues in accordance with relevant international legal standards. CCAT recently organized 3 roundtables with the GIFCT and its research network, GNet, on addressing these challenges. Our work on monitoring emerging issues, trends, and developments is mandated and guided by Security Council Resolution 2395. And our unique relations with all the member states and our close collaboration with other UN agencies, global GRN, and private sector and civil society partners place us in a unique position to identify emerging challenges and connect them to policy responses. Several other CCAT publications have helped keep the global counterterrorism community informed about emerging trends, including the prosecution of ISIL-associated women, countering terrorist narratives, and the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. CCAT also collaborated with the 1267 Committee to produce a joint report on disrupting terrorist financing. And we have conducted workshops with our UN partners on the range of relevant topics, including the use of biometric technologies in the context of pandemic-related measures and watch listing guidance relating to known and suspected terrorists. Needless to say, our ongoing dialogue with member states continues to inform and drive all such initiatives. The fundamental factors that fuel terrorism and violent extremism continue to plague many regions of the world. And in order to address those factors, we must ensure comprehensive, whole of society, human rights compliant, gender sensitive approaches that also address new challenges that have emerged. And we can only achieve these through enhanced partnerships, multilateralism, dialogue, and international cooperation. We look forward to continuing our partnership with all of you and with the organizers of this event. I do thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary General. I think it's worth underscoring your message that while we are seeing important positive developments, we really do need to continue to focus on efforts to rehabilitate, reintegrate, to understand the impact of misinformation so that we can maintain those positive developments. Before turning to our last speaker, I wanted to invite others to submit your questions. We are receiving several. We have seen those, the panelists, and our team is taking those on, and we'll address as many as we can in the Q&A session. We'll also be posting a link to the website where the presentation made by Steve can be accessed. So next, I'd like to invite our final speaker, Alistair Reid, the Executive Director of the Resolve Network. The floor is yours.
Great. Good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending where you are. Thank you very much for this opportunity to comment on this report. I'll try and keep my remarks brief for a report which has got so much data within it. I really do encourage people to take the opportunity to read the report within its entirety and just beyond the headline figures, because it does include so much information and so much insightful analysis. I'm going to make some brief reflections on the main results from the report and then move on to reflections about the evolving threat from terrorism. But firstly, I just want to start by saying a big thank you to the Global Terrorism Index and to the Global Terrorism Database, in which the work is based on, for their important work they do. Terrorism is like any problem. To be able to properly address it, you need to be able to first understand it fully. For this, empirical research is so important, and the GTI provides both insightful research and important data for policymakers and researchers alike. Moving on to my general comments, the first thing to start off with, like Steve highlighted, is the good news. Terrorism is down 5 years in a row. However, the scale of the challenge is still immense. 63 countries in 2019 recorded at least one death, and 17 countries recorded over 100 deaths. And the number of deaths are still nearly double that of what it was in 2001. And of course, we can't measure the impact of terrorism in just deaths alone, as terrorism is both the threat of violence and not just actual violence. So the perception and fear of terrorism and its impact may still be much greater than the data implies. The biggest drops in terrorism were in both Afghanistan and Nigeria, which is very welcome news, but it also highlights the global nature, or whilst highlighting the global nature of terrorism, also highlights how the impact of terrorism is highly concentrated. The two countries between them accounted for 50% of the global deaths of terrorism, and just 10 countries account for 80% of deaths. To put this into context, since 2002, only 0.5% of the total deaths of terrorism have been in the West. The brunt of terrorism is still predominantly felt by countries in the global south. If we take a look beneath some of the data in the report and look at the top 10 countries affected by terrorism, we notice the long-term protracted nature of the conflicts driving terrorism. From a Western perspective, the so-called war on terror is almost 20 years old. But if we look at, again, at the top 10 countries most affected, we see conflicts which go back decades. This highlights that there's no easy solutions and that terrorism is a long-term problem that requires long-term solutions. And also, we need to avoid taking a Western perspective where we only see terrorism predominantly in terms of jihadi and far-right groups. If we take a look at the top 10 countries most affected by terrorism, we see that terrorism unfortunately comes in many different forms with many different ideologies across the political spectrum. Moving on to the changes and evolution from the threat from terrorism, as highlighted before, the two big stories coming out of the GTI is the decline and displacement of ISIL in the Middle East and the rise of far-right violence in the West. Starting with ISIL, we've seen a continued decline of ISIL core in Syria and Iraq, with, as Steve mentioned, for the first time, the number of deaths dropping below 1,000. However, we need to be careful not to be complacent. That whilst ISIL core has experienced significant decline in its capability and loss of territory, it's not defeated. To a certain extent, we have been here before, back in 2007, following the Anbar awakening in Iraq. And we have seen how ISIL, or the Islamic State in Iraq as it was then, was able to rebuild itself and to reach even greater heights. If we are not careful, it may be able to do so again. The decline of ISIL core has been coupled with the rise and expansion of ISIL's provinces and affiliates. ISIL's geographic spread now reaches across Europe, Russia, Eurasia, Asia, and Africa. In 2019, its affiliates accounted for 74% of ISIL-related deaths. And the ongoing trend has been a continued displacement of activity away from the MENA regions, with particularly increasing activity in sub-Saharan Africa, which now accounts for 40% of the deaths. This apparent displacement of ISIL provinces and affiliates raises many questions with future development of ISIL, with the ISIL threat. Will any of these locations serve as a safe haven for ISIL core to regroup and relaunch? Will any of these groups replicate the foreign terrorist fighter phenomenon of Syria and Iraq? Globally, this may be harder because just geographically, none of these countries are in a place which are easy to attract recruits from around the world, but maybe regionally, what some of them may act as a lightning rod to attract fighters from across the region. But perhaps from a Western perspective, the most important question is, will any of these affiliates become the new Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula? Al-Qaeda, as remember, had many affiliates similar to ISIS, but it was only Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula that developed to plan and execute attacks in the West. Moving on to the second trend, the rise of the far right in the West. Well, the threat remains high from ISIL. The last few years have seen a dramatic rise and increase in the threat presented by the far right, with a dramatic 250% increase in FarRight terrorism over the last few years, with FarRight terrorism now reaching up to 80% of the deaths from terrorism in the West. Addressing FarRight terrorism is the focus of a new major resolve project on religious and ethically motivated violent extremism, which will be publishing a number of important reports in the new year. One of the key features of FarRight terrorism that report highlights is that the majority of attacks are carried out by lone wolf actors and not affiliated with a specific group or far-right organization. Lone actors present their own unique challenges to counterterrorism, in that the way in which we can counterterrorism policies faces groups does not work to the same extent with lone actors. But however, the unaffiliated nature of perpetrators highlights the diffuse nature of the far-right threat and the difficulties in defining it. In contrast to ISIL, where it was easier to identify and such there was a global consensus on the threat they presented, the far right is far harder to define, and as a result, much harder to establish a consensus on the nature of the threat, and a situation that has been made harder by the blurring of lines between far-right extremism and mainstream right-wing politics in many countries. This is particularly evident when we look at the challenge of tackling far-right extremism online. Exactly where do we draw the line and which material should be removed is a much more complicated discussion than it was confronting ISIL propaganda. It also highlights a wider issue that lots of the counterterrorism policies which we learned and developed in addressing the ISIL threat may not be as applicable to the far-right threat, and we need to be careful that we don't use a one-size-fits-all approach and develop policies which are tailored to the threat as it emerges. The final point from this report that I wanted to highlight was that the rise in far-right terrorism is part of a broader rise in political violence across the political spectrum. And the report also highlights the decline in positive peace indicators and increase in political polarization across the West, and a worrying rise in the acceptance of violence as a political tactic in some countries. Unless these trends are addressed, they lay the foundations for a further increase in political violence. I'll end my remarks there and hand back to Melissa, and I look forward to answering your questions and discussing these issues further.
Thank you very much, Alistair. It's a lot of information to cover across the three presentations that we've had. And indeed, we have several questions lined up already, but we do invite you to continue to submit those, and we will try to package them together where possible. Steve, the first question is addressed to you, and it comes from Mohammed Abu Shakra. He notes that the correlation between conflict and terrorism seems quite obvious from the data, and asks what type of conflicts had the biggest impact on terrorism activity. Can this correlation be inferred to the relationship between conflict and radicalization and drivers of violent extremism?
Yeah, look, it's a very, very good question. So the first thing I'd say is that there's a really strong relationship between the intensity of conflict and the level of terrorism. So it springs out quite often of a war setting. So if we're looking at Afghanistan, for example, it's got the highest level of terrorism currently globally. And if we move maybe beyond Yemen, it's the country with probably the most intense conflict which is going on. So the terrorism quite often gets caught up in terms of these ongoing conflicts. So for me, rather than there's a whole range of other things we can pull into it. You can look at the levels of alienation. You can look at the group grievances that where different ethnic or religious groups are fractured. You can look at the fighting of fractionalised elites. There are other things which come in and create the background conditions for higher levels of terrorism as well. But first and foremost, I'd say it's the intensity of the conflict in the country, and then the terrorism is a byproduct of that. Has anyone else got any comments?
What I suggest we do is I'll direct a few questions to you all, and in the last 10 minutes, I will invite each of our speakers to share some final reflections. So if a question wasn't addressed to you, then please feel free to incorporate that into your final reflections. Thank you, Steve. And the next question that I have is addressed to Michelle. In the last year's GTI, you contributed a piece entitled Women's Involvement in Terrorism, New Trends and Developments. And one participant noted, it was Pablo Arocha of the Mexican Permanent Mission here in New York, noted the fact that terrorist acts and mass shootings are carried out by men, suggesting that addressing masculinity challenges is essential to fully understand and address the issue of de-radicalization and to prevent future attacks, rather than with more use of force. Could this analysis be further complemented with a gender perspective? What developments has CCAT observed over the last year, and what trends might you anticipate for the year ahead?
Thanks a lot for this question. You must know that the gender is what we call the cross-cutting issue, which is being taken on board in all our missions, assessment missions, but also in our analytical work. So we look at the motivations, the roles of women played in violent extremism and terrorism, and how to counter violent extremism and countering terrorism. Now, the masculinity is something that is seldom being touched on by researchers. And hence CCAT together with IPI started to have some consultations with them on the masculinity. And I must say that the research is still very scarce, and so we need much more segregated facts, data, concrete data, in order to make sure that the decision makers and the policy makers are well informed. So much more to come, but something that is under our radar and that we are taken on board.
Thank you very much. Alistair, my next question is directed to you, and it comes from Dr. Göktürk Sönmez from Turkey. He writes, based on the very illuminating and impressive data set presented and on your own research, what can you say about the discussions about ISIS 2.0 or the resurrection revival of the group, and how do you explain the group's shifting weight towards South Asia and, more importantly, Sub-Saharan Africa? And perhaps, Steve, I'll also invite you to address this question as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. The first thing to take into account when you think about ISIS's strategy is its strategy in stages, very similar to Mao's strategy of insurgency, where you go up in different stages. So at a stage when we go back a few years, at the height of the caliphate, they're gone past the insurgency stage and we're establishing their own territory. But what they've simply done is gone back down to a lower stage, and we've gone back into the countryside and back underground. And there is every possibility, if we don't take the right action, of them rising up to the next stage and coming back to where we were. As I mentioned in my remarks, that back in 2007, following the Anbar awakening, Islamic State in Iraq, as it was known at the time, was significantly dilapidated and declined as a response of the awakening. But it went underground again, went back into the countryside, and then saw its moment and revived itself and rose much even higher to strength. Well, if we look at the situation at the moment in Syria and Iraq, ISIL is very much on the back foot, and its leadership has been decimated. But this doesn't mean that it won't be able to regroup in the countryside and won't be able to regroup underground and be able to rebuild in itself. So there's something we need to be able to watch. It's moved to sub-Saharan Africa and also to Southeast Asia and South Asia. This is part of both strategy and opportunity, in that ISIS sees its struggle as global, but also realizes that its global struggle is won locally. So it'd be a strategy of building on lots of local conflicts and then building those back to its global agenda. I think on that, I'll pass back to Steve if you want to add your comments on the data.
Thanks, Alistair. Look, first up, Alistair, I'd just like to comment on your comments. I thought you made some great comments, and I think this is really something we really do need to be focused on, because just as ISIL arose out of Al-Qaeda, and we saw the graph earlier on and just how fluid these groups are, the way they form, they break up, disappear, reform. So I think the key thing for me when I look at it is what you need a country with how can I put it, is a very, very poor resilience. So that means a government which can't control its territory, one which isn't popular, hasn't got the support of the locals, one where there's deep divides within the communities, and one where generally there's a whole lot of corruption, which in many ways leads to incompetence within the governments. So as we start to look at this is the fertile grounds which we saw happen in Iraq, and sort of after the invasion there, set up a government. The government was really corrupt, very ineffective, very partisan, and out of that created the background. So we can see a similar sort of thing in a number of these countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So one of the focuses for me would be on how can we actually get in and try and improve, let's say, the overall qualities of the society. And when you're looking at these ecological issues as well, particularly the increases in population, it's easy to see how these countries can spit out of control. So I think one is they've got the military operations, which are essential, and they need strong supporting from the West, both I think in terms of the soldiers and also in terms of the intelligence. But we also need to be able to try and focus on how can we get better social structures, less corruption, and to what extent we can to get inclusiveness, and also try and really get on top of some of these future ecological problems. So it's all intertwined to me. That's my simplistic view on it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Steve. I think military operations are very important, but unless we actually address the context on the grounds which create the space for which terrorism to develop and evolve, we'll never be able to properly solve the solution.
And I think your comments, we do really have to be concerned about another ISIL-like group rising up in those areas. It's just noticing overnight there was some attacks in Nigeria up on the farmers from Islamic terrorists, and they beheaded 40 people, beheaded 40 men, and then killed a couple of hundred other people as farmers as well. So it's there. It really is there.
Thank you both. I wanted to turn our attention to, as many of our speakers have mentioned, something that has drawn a lot of attention, which is the rise of right-wing extremism, which we've seen is considerable and consistent increase. So this is a question for all of our panelists. What does the future of far-right extremism hold, especially considering that many of the attacks were carried out by individuals with no group affiliation? What does this mean for our counterterrorism approaches? Perhaps I'll start with Michelle.
Thanks a lot. We alluded to it. There is an increasing concern, and that has been vented and shared with us when we visited 2018 and 2019 31 countries. 10 of those 31 countries had a big concern about far-right or extreme right-wing terrorism. And so what are the perspectives based on our research and our reaching out to different players like the academics, civil society organizations, policymakers and experts? We have seen that far-right is certainly increasing in frequency and in lethality. And you only look back to 2019, go from Christchurch to El Paso to Halle, and this year Hanau in Germany. You see that indeed lone actors led to very lethal and deadly attacks. What we also have seen in the TCAT report, terrorism situation report, the co-production of Europol and Eurojust, that from 2017 to 2018, there was a doubling of arrests for far-right offenders. And the number of convictions in that same period raised from 4 to 22. These are clear indications. When we had our open briefing, we focused on different issues like the international character, the gender aspects, the age aspect, the financing of extreme right-wing terrorism, and we see that what we in fact lack is real concrete data and empirical research. So what we really are urging all the researchers to focus on those specific issues related to far right, and to look at the financing, to look at the gender aspect and the masculinity, to look at online, offline presence, but also to come to the fore with comparative analyses, not to have a conflation of the approaches that are typical for ISIL and Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorist groups and for extreme right-wing terrorist groups, and also to have a comparative analysis between different countries and regions. And only then we will be able to, I would say, properly inform the decision makers and the policy makers in order to have the right policy in place. So a lot of work to be done, but the concern is an absolute growing concern.
Just jump in. I say that it's very hard to sort of predict the future, but I'll make one point that the diffuse nature of the far-right threat is both a positive and a negative from a counterterrorism perspective. On the one hand, most of the attacks have been carried out by unaffiliated lone actors, and the lack of any central organization with a central command and control makes it harder from a counterterrorism perspective. There's not a central organization you can infiltrate, or you can listen into it through surveillance, etc., etc. But on the other hand, the diverse nature of the far right makes it far harder for it to come together and coalesce in one organization. We talk about the far right almost like it's one thing, but it's this diverse spectrum of groups, of really, of wide varying types of ideologies, and which makes it far harder for any of them to coalesce around one particular idea and to organize into one particular organization, as opposed to ISIS, some of the other Islamist groups. So on the one hand, while it's often harder to target, the chances of the far right becoming more organized and more coalescing into more coherent unit is something which I think is less likely. But also, we do run the risk of the far right having lots of a disparate threat of multiple different groups and continue to split and splinter, which has a history of doing.
So my sense on the far right, at this stage we're looking at the far right, but I think also we need to think about the far left as we move forward into the future as well. For me, it's the background conditions in the Western democracies, and if you like, those conditions have been decaying over the last decade. So we can see when we're measuring this through, let's say, our measures of resilience, which are positive peace, we can see that you can break it up into three different domains: attitudes, institutions, and structures. And structures are things like a rising per capita income, increased life expectancy, increased gender equality, and things like that. Those things are all improving. If we're looking at the institutions, it's a little bit more how can I put it, marginal. So we found some things are improving, some other things are deteriorating. But if we look at the attitudes domain, all of the attitudes in many of the European countries and in the US have deteriorated. And this is particularly things like group grievances. You get fractionalised elites, misinformation, a growing inequality between the rich and the poor. And so what we're finding if you look over the last decade, you've found a erosion of working conditions. You're finding in many places the wages are actually being deteriorating, particularly after you take into place inflation. And these are sort of the kind of background conditions which create the alienation and dissatisfaction with the system, which motivate some individuals to do radical acts. And I think this is where we've got to start focusing as a society. And as we can't, if you watch it now and you watch the policies which most of the Western governments are going to be taking coming out of the COVID-19, these economies aren't going to get back quickly. The economies were really sluggish before we went into the COVID-19 lockdowns. There's going to be an excess of labour over jobs. A lot of the things being the stimuluses created in the recovery are about stimulating the supply side of the economy. So that's pumping a lot of money in it, putting it into the banks loan the money out, businesses then to invest for recovery. But we live in a consumer-based economy, so 70 to 75% of most economies are consumer-based. So consumers' wages aren't improving, then the supply side of it's missing. And if there's a surplus of labour over jobs, we can only expect working conditions to deteriorate in the future, and a lot of that plays into it. But as our societies really aren't trying to address these broad systemic issues, rather we're sort of going back to policies which were really been in place for the 15 years leading up to the COVID-induced depression or recession, depending on how you want to name it.
Thank you all. And I think across all of your responses, we really understand that upholding human rights, respecting civil liberties is really fundamental to improving peace. I would like to next invite Michelle and Alistair to respond to a question that comes to us from Dallin Van Leeuwen from the International Institute of Justice and the Rule of Law. And he asks, how do we overcome the lag in time problem of responding to the threat of terrorism? That is, how do we become more proactive rather than reactive to terrorist threats? Alistair, perhaps I can start with you this time.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, this is not a problem just for countering terrorism. This is a sort of perennial political problem, and that issues become a priority for politicians normally once they've reached a certain level. And unfortunately, often with terrorism, it's too late. And we need to be able to have a priority to be able to look at be alert for issues beforehand and focus on the context which emerge on. Like I said earlier, we can't just focus on sort of kinetic counterterrorism responses. We need to focus on countering the threat much earlier on, countering the emergence of violent extremism and facing radicalization at the early stages. And it's really about changing political priorities, but also it means remaining a political priority after a threat has been faced. So in the case of ISIS, not seeing that we have this decline now, we can take our foot off the gas and we can look elsewhere. Actually, you need to be able to keep the focus on while the threat is diminished, to keep the threat diminished. And this is the same with far right and other types of terrorism. I'll hand over to Michelle.
Thanks, Alistair. Well, I think that if you want to be effective in the fight against terrorism and violent extremism, you have to be active, reactive, rapid reactive, and pre-active. And hence, what we do is we have this listening ear and this ongoing dialogue with all the member states. So we follow up with the radar all the different moves in the different countries and member states, and couple it to open source information and the research analyses of trends and threats, and trying at least to be constantly ahead of the curve. So if we are now confronted with the impact of COVID-19, look at specific parts of the society. What do we see with youngsters overly utilizing internet? Is that a usage of internet something that might fragilize them when they make use of gaming platforms? Might it be targeted by terrorist, violent extremism, or extreme right-wing terrorist? Question mark. What about security over land and sea? If there are heavy controls because of COVID-19 on land and in the air, maybe there is a movement possible towards the sea, and maritime security becomes an issue. And that's exactly what we're constantly doing and informing about these ongoing trends ahead of the curve, the Security Council Counterterrorism Committee, in order to allow them to go for the right policy developments, the right norm setting. So everything we do must be based on empirical research, analyses of concrete data, but coupled, and I think it's extremely important, to our constant ongoing dialogue with the 193 member states, looking at Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, America, Europe at the same time, and seeing how there are really differences in specific teams, in the involvement and development of teams across those regions, across the borders of those regions, and in different states of the same region, and to inform the Security Council as soon as possible as we see that this trend, this threat is something that is not a coincidence any longer.
Thank you both. Turning now to Steve, and then perhaps Alistair and Michelle, if you have anything to add, please do. A question that asks, and I guess just to note that the report is essentially covering data that was collected for 2019. However, it does touch on the COVID-19 pandemic, given its great impact and the shock that it has had across our entire global community. So the question here is, if you could share some of your analysis or ideas about the efforts that extremist groups may be employing to take advantage of this pandemic, but also how might government, civil society be best prepared to respond to that? So Steve, over to you first.
Right, okay, so I haven't got much information on that. The other two panelists may have a lot more, but I'm sorry, I don't have a lot. But what it would say, when we're looking into 2000 and the COVID era, there are two types of violence which we've seen increase. And so the first type of violence is self-harm, and the second type is domestic violence. And so that seems to be pretty much across the board, and so a lot of it's associated with the lockdowns. But most other form of violence is actually decreased. So homicides are down, the level of violent crimes in many places are down. We've even seen a fall in the number of battlefield deaths since the start of the COVID era as well. And so I think we'll see that flow on into terrorism as well in 2020. So there's certainly plenty of issues out there, like the attack in Nigeria, which happened overnight, which I just mentioned. But I think all in all, we're going to see a decrease in terrorism yet again in 2020. Now, it will come up and lift its heads up in many other ways and many other forms, and it may be just a hiatus before it takes off. So I guess that's what I see. I think a lot of people worry about people sitting at home on the more leisure time, let's say, that's the right word for it, on the internet, and then self-radicalising, and that various groups are putting up stuff around it. There's a lot of people who sort of might be following conspiracy theories, so there'll be more of that getting pumped out. But me, that's back to a bigger issue, which is misinformation.
I mean, I think at this stage, the impact of COVID-19 on terrorism is really sort of speculation. Everyone's speculated these sort of two things. On the one hand, the impact of COVID has led to sort of just less activity in general across society, through measures for lockdown, etc. And this may just make it harder to carry out terrorist attacks and terrorist activity to the same extent. But on the other hand, COVID-19 is a huge challenge to governments. So it also may mean that not all governments have got the capacity to deal with a global pandemic, whereas also to keep their eye focused on the terrorist threats that they face. So it may be a case that some countries take their eye off the ball in some cases, but this is still yet to be seen. But one point I will add to echo what Steve said is the issue of disinformation. One thing we have seen with COVID is the increase of sort of disinformation out there and conspiracy theories, which just feeds into the wider milieu and background and context in which we've seen a rise of political violence emerging out of.
But I'll just chip in, Alistair, and you made me think about one point, which is really important. So as we come out of the back of COVID-19, we're seeing huge amounts of money pumped into stimulating the economies, huge increases in debt. Got large government deficits. It's unlikely that economic activity will get back to 2019 level for a few years yet. So that means governments are going to be strapped for money. And so the question is, where are they going to cut back? We know they're cutting back in overseas developmental aid. But it's a trend which was there prior to the COVID era, but it'll probably be accelerated through that. So the question comes back is that the governments, in terms of their international counter-terrorist strategies, really do need to keep the effort up. Otherwise, we are likely to see this ISIL 2.0 rise somewhere else, or look, some other group. One of the other things too is if we look at we take away the Islamic terrorism, let's say, we look at the underlying levels of terrorism over the last decade, they haven't changed much. So you've got this underlying level, and you'll find it reflected in a whole range of different nations. So I think, I think that point of sort of adequate funds to fight counter-terrorism is really important.
I completely agree. I mean, one of the things that worries me is, as we come out of the back of dealing with the COVID pandemic, as you mentioned, lots of countries are going to be struggling for cash, and where will they cut back, and will it be on funding of global counterterrorism efforts? But also that is coupled with the perception that ISIS is defeated, and the perception that ISIS is at such a point of decline that it's no longer a global threat, that we may not need to contribute. So I worry about those sort of twin things influencing policy, which I really hope it don't, because we need to be able to keep our eye and focus on the threat from ISIL going forward.
I don't know if it's the right time to say something right now, but I was following with a lot of attention, and I do agree with what has been said. We devoted an extra brief and a trend alert on the impact of COVID-19 and extreme right-wing terrorism in June and July. We see clear differences on impact in the conflict zones and the non-conflict zones, and we should make difference between the short-term, mid-term, and long-term effects. and so far we only had a view on the short-term effect. What we have certainly seen is that terrorists and violent extremism have taken advantage or exploited COVID-19. They explored or exploited the confusion, the chaos, the grievances, and anxiety that was caused by and that is caused by COVID-19. But there is no evidence whatsoever of the impact of COVID-19 on increased terrorist attacks. So we have now to move to the midterm and long-term effects, which is still looking into the future. There might be indeed decreasing economic, or there might be economic downturns, increasing polarization, and as been said, increasing misinformation, disinformation, and all this might fuel radicalization in time. We're now following all the regions and together with the GRN producing the next edition of the first brief on the impact of COVID-19, focusing on the mid-term effect of COVID-19. It's certainly true that the terrorism in the first stage were paralyzed, as we all were, because of travel restrictions, that their supply chains have been affected, but in the meantime they became enormously inventive, inspiring, inciting, fundraising, recruiting terrorism and violent extremism online. So that is an increase we visibly have seen, but we don't know if that would lead to an increase of terrorist attacks and if that will last forever. Think about Sri Lanka last year. It was an ISIL-inspired terrorist attack which caused a lot of that on that Sunday, Easter, in April 2019. So that's something we cannot cast aside. So we have to keep a proactive eye on it.
Thank you all. And just to add to the discussion that's been had, indeed, there is very little evidence that terrorist groups have increased their engagement or otherwise owing to the pandemic. However, what we do see and have seen much documentation of are a rise of administrative and exceptional measures to try to enforce and to maintain and support communities or restrict freedoms. And so that actually does have, as we think about the systems thinking, a very large potential impact for us further down the line. I have many great questions, so I am going to ask two more of our panelists before I turn to them for their final contributions to this discussion. The first, I'll begin with Steve. The report has consistently looked at the economic impact of terrorism. And the question that's being raised is, what about the costs of counterterrorism? How can we factor in the human and economic costs? Is it even possible to approach a figure in the same way the GTI approaches the economic impact of terrorism?
I think, look, that's an excellent question. It's one we've struggled down here many, many times. And so the problem is one is just getting hold of the figures from enough governments around the world to make it worthwhile. The other thing is quite often terrorism gets mixed in with a whole lot of other stuff as well. So think about China. Okay, so it's estimated there's 30,000 people working on in sort of how can I put it, in internet intelligence. Okay, for want of a better word, but you get the idea. So how do you separate out them? How do you separate that out? Looking at the cyber side of it. Military operations and how do you differentiate between a military operation and a counter-terrorism operation? Because if you're looking, you've got in a conflict zone, the military's engaged there in fighting a conflict, but they're also fighting people who are committing terrorism as well. So look, it's an area we've struggled with in here. We just can't get the accurate data. That's one form of it. So the other forms can be things like, let's say, business investment. Okay, so we know there's a strong relationship between, as you increase the levels of violence, you decrease the levels of business investment. So what impact does terrorism have on that? So a couple of years ago, we did some work on the tourism industry, because you could take some very clear examples of countries with very similar economies in very similar parts of the world, one which had high-profile terrorist attacks, another which didn't, and then you could look at the changes in the income to the tourist industry, because that's something you can really measure. And it was stark. It really had impact. So in those areas where we looked at, just from memory, there's something like 6 to 7 percentage points difference in the size of those industries, simply because of some terrorist attacks. Let's say France would be an example of that after you had the attacks in Paris. So, but it gets hard. What's the cost of insurance? So we know there's insurance, the premiums associated with all of this. How do you estimate that? So our model is pretty simple. We can look at the property damage which comes in through terrorist attacks. We can look at the cost of the lifetime earnings of the people who are killed in the attacks, and we can look at the cost of the injuries through the people injured in the attacks. And they're the three dimensions which we bring together. And now we also factor in another thing. If the country's actually in a high level of conflict or sort of war, we also factor in a percentage of the loss of the GDP associated with that war into the model as well. But so it gives an idea of the changes over time, but the real figures are likely to be 5 times as higher, maybe more.
Michelle or Alistair, anything to add to that, or shall we move to the next question?
Yes, I want to add briefly about it. I think the economic impact just highlights how the impact of a terrorist attack can go far beyond the immediate victims or even the perception of fear beyond it. We think about some of the terrorist attacks on tourist destinations in Egypt and Tunisia, which effectively shut down the tourism for a whole year or two and had, widespread impact society far beyond the numbers of people who were injured and killed.
Thank you all. I realize that was a rapid fire Q&A session, but a lot of content to cover. I'll turn to each of you now for any final reflections in these last minutes. But I will just share the final question I was going to raise, which comes to us from Kyle Beaulieu, and he asks, what is the most significant shift that the international donor community needs to make in terms of programming for countering violent extremism? So for this session, if I may perhaps first turn to Michelle, followed by Alistair, and concluding with Steve.
Thanks a lot. I think that what CCAT exactly is trying to do for the Security Council is to make sure that on the basis of even-handed, thorough, independent, neutral assessments, we make in fact a sort of a free audit for all the member states on what their security measures look like, what their CT and CVE measures look like. And if we can use those and have a priority setting and follow the recommendations defined by the Security Council and share them as much as possible, and if possible, with all the donor community, with the UN family, we will have targeted and focused technical assistance and capacity building, rather than waiting for a facilitation of technical assistance based on requests from the member states or on perceived needs from the member states. So a more coordinated, an even more coordinated approach based on our recommendation. That's exactly what we're doing with the member states, with the UN community right now.
Great. One of the great things about the Global Terrorism Index is the wealth of data in it, but also the wealth of historical data that it has and the analysis. And if you go back and look at the historical data, you see just how long-term protracted the issue of terrorism is in many countries. But also you see how it has constantly evolved and changed over time. And I think the important lessons to take from this is that governments need to invest in counterterrorism and particularly important countering violent extremism policies in the long term, but at the same time to be flexible and to keep the eye on emerging changes and new threats emerge, so they're not addressing the last threat while the new threat is emerging.
So I think my final comments is the first thing is, look, when discussing terrorism, it always ends up in the negative and pessimistic side of everything which is happening, and that's pretty much the way this conversation has gone. However, I just want to come back and finish with the positives. So 103 countries actually improved their score on the Global Terrorism Index for 2019. Only 35 deteriorated. And that's the best result since we've been doing the index. However, 63 countries did have an attack. So it's wide and it's spread and it's something of concern, but we should never overlook the positives. I think the second point I'd make is to differentiate between the advanced economies. In some ways, that's sort of the West, and also between developing economies, because the drivers in the two are very, 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 very different. So the one core thing we can do when most of the violence is occurring, that's 99.5% more terrorism deaths, is in what we'd see as the developing economies. And the best thing we can do to stop terrorism is to get on top of the conflicts and try and stop them. So the first thing is, don't start conflicts unless they absolutely have to be had. The second thing is, so they do start, really work out what is going to be a peaceful solution as quickly as possible within those countries. The last thing I'd say, we put a lot of focus on the rise of the far right, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to end up with far left terrorism in the future. And that's back to what those issues which are described earlier on in the Western societies, or what we call as the West. So it's a need to really focus on those underlying factors associated with what we call positive peace, and the attitudes which I've mentioned, I won't repeat now, and really start to look at how do we improve the resilience of our societies.
Thank you all. And if there's one key message I hear across all of your closing statements, it's that really the gains should be celebrated. They shouldn't be taken for granted, and a lot of work needs to be done in order to sustain those. But also we need to sharpen our focus where the threat continues and has shifted and evolved. I'd like to thank our speakers, Steve, Michelle, and Alistair, for your time and your many thoughtful contributions to this discussion. On behalf of our partners for this event, the Institute for Economics and Peace and the United States Institute of Peace, and in collaboration with the Global Research Network of CTED, thank you for joining us.